Hi, y'all. I'm Marcy Saran, and I'm the Executive Director of EDIN. We do education and insight on eating disorders. Eating disorders are not about food. They're about mental health, and there is always something else going on. And so we do a lot of work with comorbidity, depression, anxiety, and right now during COVID, these things thrive in isolation. One of the things we talk about is body positivity. So Abby is on our board, and we are partners, and we really work towards the same mission of helping people like the skin that they're in. And so we support everything that Clarity Fitness does, and we're really happy that you're here. And if you want to hop on our site, I sent everyone a note on the chat. You could look at myedin.org and see all of the programming and all the things happening. Right now, it's the 20th anniversary of an awareness walk that we do. And this year, because we can't all 400 of us go walk together, we are having a 0K. And so it's a virtual walk to support eating disorder awareness. So you can hop on there and learn about it. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And we can kick it off with Brian. Thank you so much for being here today. We are super excited to really get into more of the nitty-gritty science behind introduction and reintroduction of movement during and after eating disorder recovery. So we are ready for you whenever you are, and we can get started. And I can't wait to hear all of your awesome information.
Great. No pressure.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so thank you for having me here. I've obviously never spoken to EDIN before, but I'm really excited about this. And Marcy, I think you hit the nail right on the head. The biggest misconception, I think, about eating disorders is it's about eating, and it's not. It's about so much more. And if you kind of take that paradigm into the microcosm of exercise and movement with eating disorders, I think it really hits home. So a big thing that I do in my work and what we do at Alsana, and I know Abby does at Clarity, is really tease that apart, because if we just focus on what exercise is or the movement is, it's kind of missing the boat. It's, a little too close to the forest to see the trees. So we have to kind of step back and say, what's really affecting all of this right here? And when you do that, and certainly the field has done that in the last, say, 20 years or so, we've really shifted our orientation around exercise and movement in eating disorders to understand that bigger picture. That's when you really see some phenomenal gains. And obviously Abby sees it every day in her practice. At Clarity, we see it every day with our movement dimension of our adaptive care model at Alsana. So the first thing that we want to go over with this, and Abby's going to help me out, she's going to jump in throughout some of these, are just dispel some of those myths and misconceptions that we've already kind of started talking about. So this was a perfect setup, and Marcy and I didn't coordinate with this, so I love the synergy of this right now, how everything is just kind of coming together. Then we'll give some practical tips about how to define who is at risk or who isn't at risk, and then some stuff that we do both at Alsana and Clarity with working with clients, and some practical tips to kind of set that environment up to help a client that may be struggling with exercise in their eating disorder. So the first thing is, let's get into some myths, play Mythbusters. I grew up watching that show, so I love it. And this is like my favorite thing that I do, is doing myth busting. So the first one, myths and misconceptions. Everyone with an eating disorder excessively exercises. If I had a nickel for every time I heard that exercise causes an eating disorder, I'd have enough nickels that I wouldn't need to be here right now. I'd be on South Pacific Island with an umbrella in my drink. What do y'all think about this, about how many people with eating disorders actually are truly letting exercise run them into the ground, pun intended?
This is Marcy. I think that that's part of it. I think it's certainly part of it. I don't think it's right. Like, people who have eating disorders don't look like they have an eating disorder all the time.
Absolutely.
You might not know.
Absolutely. And I think you hit it right on the head there. It's definitely part of it for many individuals. When we look at the overall numbers, probably the best study that shows this is a study put out led by Schroff and colleagues a few years ago. But breaking it down, we see a lot of variance by the subtype of eating disorders. Certainly with anorexia, we see a lot more pathological exercise. And in fact, actually, only the purging subtype of anorexia has the simple majority of individuals with that diagnosis, that the majority of them are engaging in a pathological form of excessive exercise. In other words, exercise that would meet the criteria. What I find to be incredibly ironic about this is that if you read the diagnostic criteria for anorexia, it doesn't really mention exercise much, but yet the diagnostic criteria for bulimia explicitly states exercise as part of it. You look at the bulimia rates of excessive exercise or pathological exercise, and you're in the 20 to 25% range. So I think these are some of the things that have shifted our understanding of this. I remember about maybe 15, 20 years ago, the big thing in the popular media was exercise bulimia. That kind of is a term that isn't really a diagnostic thing in the APA or DSM or ICD sense, but it's something that we kind of latch onto. I guess nowadays we talk about it more in terms of orthorexia. But it's really interesting because, like I said, the majority of people with eating disorders aren't struggling with this. So what this does is it informs us about what Marcy said. It's only a part of it. It's not the whole thing. So I think this is another good thing to further reinforce what Marcy said at the beginning, is that we can't have these kind of black and white notions about what an eating disorder looks like or what they do. Just because somebody is exercising a lot doesn't necessarily mean they have an eating disorder, and it doesn't necessarily mean they don't. So it's much, much more complicated than what we can see behaviorally. Including exercise and treatment will lead to harmful outcomes. Again, a big, big thing that the field is fighting. And Abby, I'll let you jump in on this because I'm sure you get this all the time with the work that you do in body positive fitness and things like that.
Definitely. I had to find my unmute button technology stuff. But yeah, this is definitely, we've seen this a lot. We've heard this concern a lot. And we've talked about this. It is still a scary thing for everybody involved, I think. And that's why I love having these kinds of conversations, is to give peace and bring confidence that it can be okay when you're in a setting that knows what would be harmful and what would be safe and effective and productive for self-care. So I think that this is definitely a myth. I definitely didn't know that at one point in time, but I'm excited to see the facts of why this isn't true.
Absolutely, and you're right, it is a myth. And I think what you said really sums it up nicely, is that it's not just exercise. I think the word exercise has so much loading and connotation, and all of us are thinking about a certain thing when we think of the word exercise. Mm-hmm. It really doesn't hold water, and we'll get into some of that a little bit more in this presentation. But we have a good evidence base for this, believe it or not, in the literature, in the scientific literature, and then certainly anecdotally from the clinical world. And not only do we have enough individual studies, but we've got enough where we can do a technique called meta-analysis. And meta-analysis is a way to quantify statistically exactly what's happening. And the meta-analyses that have been done on exercise overwhelmingly show that there is a way to add exercise into eating disorder treatment. And when you do that, you can actually amp up the outcomes. We've seen this personally at Alsana. I've compared, the other hat that I wear at Alsana is not just the movement, but the kind of nerdy research number stuff. So I'm a little bit of an anomaly. I'm half jock, half nerd. We also look at this, and I've looked at the data that we had from before we added in the movement component and the relational component, and then after we added that in. And our outcomes get blown away when we add in movement and relational aspects. We get bigger reductions in eating disorder symptoms and overall larger increases in health-related quality of life. So this is actually something that's really big. I've got all of these little subscript or superscript numbers on the side here. At the end of these slides, and I'm happy to share these with everyone, there's a list of references for this. Back in 2016, my team and I published a review of the effective methods for including exercise in treatment. So it's not just, hey, everyone go run. It's nothing like that. There's actual protocols that you have to follow for this. We came up with 11 evidence-based protocols that ensure safety and ensure that we're moving towards a good direction with better outcomes. These are the same protocols that our program at Alsana is based on, actually, so I can say even from a clinical perspective that they appear to work. And we do see that when you follow these protocols, exercise does appear to be safe. We also see improvements in the kind of traditional fitness domains, the strength, cardiovascular aspects, but also the psychological part. And this isn't something that's new. Like I said, this has been going on for at least 30 years. And in Europe, this is very commonplace. I do a lot of work in Europe, actually. And there's a treatment center in Norway that recently published an article that described 15 years of including exercise in their treatment model. And in that 15 years, they didn't have any adverse events. They had one person fall and break an arm. I don't know if that was related to their eating disorder, if it was just random. All I can say is I wish in the last 15 years, all I had from exercise was one broken arm, because that's a pretty good track record. So we do see that this is safe. In the literature, there are no adverse events reported that include like things like death, what we're all concerned about. So there are ways to do this. And the key to including this to be safe in treatment is to get them adhering to their meal plan, get clients adhering to their meal plan. At that point, the physiology takes over some of the magical thinking of the psychology. And that's really the important thing that I want to emphasize, is that for too long, I think the field has had this kind of notion of what it means to have an eating disorder that's been irrespective of physiology. And this is why you also see a lot of these studies published in more physiologically focused journals, because it really is a physiological thing. It's about getting your body to work optimally. How can we use fitness to literally strengthen the body, but also metaphysically strengthen the soul as well? And we can quantify that. So when we do that, even in clients with eating disorders, we see that it does work. And that goes to the next myth. All right, well, that may be okay for the run-of-the-mill client, but what about the run-of-the-marathon client? So say somebody with severe anorexia. Isn't that somebody who should never exercise again? And there's a little bit of truth to this. I don't want to have this presentation or anything that I do come off as an absolute, and I've already mentioned that. There are certainly some people that should never exercise again, that are just not there, whether it's a medical complication or whether it's just not being able to do that work, to be able to get to the point to feel their body and respond to their body and understand, what is my body telling me? The mind has a way of making the body do things that it normally doesn't want to do. There's an evolutionary failsafe that is involved with that, but unfortunately an eating disorder can overtake that. So we do have to be careful with that. So it does then fall on us as professionals to make sure that we can ensure safety as much as possible. That said, even with individuals with severe anorexia, we can manage this. And we have case reports of things like resistance training, believe it or not, being a benefit for individuals with even severe anorexia. So there's a randomized control trial, actually, that looks at individuals with, and for those of you that don't know, randomized control trials are the gold standard of research, the best designs that can really isolate an effect. But there's been randomized control trials of individuals with anorexia doing resistance training, and they actually respond very well to it. It makes sense because it's the straw that stirs the drink and gets the physiology going. So when they are refueling and refeeding, all of that refueling and refeeding is being basically kind of funneled into an area that can help pack on muscle mass, for example. Hypertrophy is what we call it in the exercise science world. You need that fueling and that behavior to trigger together to create that. When you do that, you see metabolic consequences happen that further enhance recovery in anorexia. So this is quantified in the literature, actually. We also have a case study that was put out about a year or two ago of an individual with long-standing anorexia, osteopenia, menstrual dysfunction, compulsive exercise. In other words, our typical, worst case scenario that you would look at and say, never exercise again. And this group, again, out of Norway, they do a lot of great work with this in Europe, a different group than the last study that I mentioned, said, all right, you know what? Forget everything else. This client is not responding to any of the psychotherapy. She's not on board with her eating disorder treatment. Exercise is really getting in the way of that. let's modify the exercise and see if we can actually help. And all they did was 3 sets of a 5-rep max, 3 times a week for 16 weeks with a variety of different muscle groups. And the article does explain those muscle groups. And what they ended up finding, obviously a bone strength, a muscle strength improvement, but also bone density improvement. This is a client who I believe was around 30 years old. So right at the end of that window where you'd expect bone mass to be packing on. Physiologically, this is incredibly difficult. And to me, this just shows the power of, again, working with your body and not against your body. While they didn't intervene specifically on the eating disorder or the psychopathology, they also didn't see any change in this. So what's important to show with this study is that exercise is not the end-all be-all, but it is one key important piece of the puzzle. And when we add that important piece of the puzzle to the mix, then we can give the body the physiological substrate that it needs to work the way that it was designed to work. Once you can work the way that you're designed to work, then we can bring in the other aspect, which is the important one, the psychological aspect, the therapy aspect, the medical aspect, the nutritional aspect, the relational aspect, all of these things that come together to holistically treat somebody as a person in a truly person-centered approach, and then really see everything take off from there. So really powerful evidence, albeit just a case study, that shows that you can reverse things that even, before this was published, and there's a couple other reports of this in the literature as well in recent years, I mean, we thought this wasn't possible. So really interesting stuff. I alluded to this one a second ago, and this is a fun one. I recommend that you do this with your clients, but just ask them, hey, free association here. When I say exercise, what do you think? Anybody want to jump in on this? No takers? Okay. I think a lot of us have and I'm setting you up, so thank you for not feeding into me. But I think we have a lot of misconceptions that exercise is all of the, stupid cliches from the 70s and 80s, right? No pain, no gain. Don't hit the wall, run through it. That was the motto on my high school track t-shirt, actually. All of these things, right? If you're resting, your opponent's getting better. That's kind of a more recent one that I get a lot from athletes. Things like that. A lot of our clients think that to exercise, you have to be sweating, you have to be throwing up. I mean, how many of us had coaches or even gym teachers that put a bucket in the middle of the room and said, we're not leaving until that's full? And I don't mean that to be crude, but that happens a lot. I've heard many clients say that. I know I've had coaches that have done that. But this is an absolute myth. And the idea behind including any type of kinesthetic approach, any type of movement or exercise to the table is being non-judgmental, wiping the slate clean, and rebuilding everything from the ground up. That's the key with this. We're not going to go in and say, okay, yoga is going to fix everything. Nothing against yoga. I love yoga. I practice yoga. Namaste. But it's not just the only thing that we have to do. Instead, we have to find what's meaningful for a client personally. What do we do with a client if they've had, say some sexual trauma around yoga, or if they've had other trauma and putting their body in that pose is going to elicit some of those feelings, right? So it's not about any of these things, nor is it about, okay, to get a workout, because yoga is not a workout. How many of our clients say that? Then you have to be going full tilt all the way, up to, crank the dial up to 11. So in other words, you can see from these two extremes of the example that there's no one size fits all or no eating disorder specific approved exercise routine. Rather, what we have to do is, like I said, get back to basics and just understand what we're talking about. In the most basic sense, physical activity is just movement. Our bodies are built to move. I'm moving right now. My hands are going. I don't know if you can see that where the screen is cut off, things like that. But we're all doing that. When we get up, we walk to the next room, or we walk out to our car, or go for a walk with the dog, or whatever the case may be. For too long in the eating disorder world and in the literature, there's been a picking and choosing of what counts as an eating disorder movement versus, oh, that's just normal movement. Why that's a problem is because then you get into a situation, and I've seen this with clients, where they'll park at the far end of the mall parking lot, go into the opposite end of the mall, get something, go back to their car, be like, oh, whoops, I forgot something, then go back. And then that goes on for about 4 or 5 hours where they're, going in for one item. Now, you might just say, well, that's just physical activity. They're running errands. But it is compulsive. It's kind of more intentional. There's something else behind it. So rather, it actually matches the definition of an exercise because it's that intention, that specific objective that we have to intervene on. What we've learned in the last 15 to 20 years in the eating disorder world is that if we hone in on that specific objective, that's the key to unlocking how exercise is related to an eating disorder, how clients are using it in a compensatory fashion, either as a way to compensate for calories or to regulate emotions, or in to kind of match rules of perfectionism and rigidity, or in attempt to control weight or shape, or a whole host of other kind of irrational rules that we believe about exercise. Those are the objectives. Psychologists call this the functionality of a behavior, right? What's the function of a behavior? If we can attack that and get to that, then we can unlock the meaning behind that. We can get it back to how exercise should be involved in our lives in holistic health and healing, the fitness domains that we talked about on the previous slides, how exercise can contribute to health. If we are looking for a physical performance aspect, complete a 5K or whatever the case may be, or 0K, I guess, as it were at the beginning of this, then that's a different thing that we have to do for this. So it really is about what's the orientation that we're taking. It has nothing to do with intensity. And that's a big thing that we're fighting as professionals, especially mental health professionals, against the fitness industry. Right now, the fitness industry, a lot of carnival barking that goes on in that industry. You're really emphasizing, hey, we'll squeeze in a whole day's worth of workouts into a 5-minute HIIT workout. That doesn't really match physiology. It sounds great for our busy schedules. And the reason all that came about is because, the number one impediment to exercise in general is time. But with a person with an eating disorder, that gets really misconstrued. So we have to look at that and say, we can't take that objective of cramming everything into a acute period of time, because it's really just going to trigger other things. There needs to be more processing around that specific objective to underlie the function of that behavior. Because ultimately it just doesn't match with the eating disorder. So it's not about cramming in an intensity. It's not about doing more. It's not about sweating. It's not about anything. It's about what you want to do. And we got to realize that exercise, doesn't mean all of that. You can get all of the benefits from low intensity. So like I said, all of this is just one piece of a very big puzzle. So hopefully that was good and challenges a few of the thoughts and myths and misconceptions that y'all had about exercise. So now let's get into who is actually at risk. And when it comes to risk factors with this, the behavior of exercise is really static. There's really nothing, like I said earlier, that we can say, oh, well, this is an approved behavior versus this is not. Certainly I wouldn't want, a client who's in a kind of more vulnerable state, working on treatment, or maybe not even at that point of going to treatment yet, to be doing other forms of exercise. And I don't want to name names of any particular place because I don't want to be punitive or be liable, with certain fitness routines or programs. But you have to look at what's the motivation behind those programs and what's the orientation that you take. When we look at that, that's where we can really objectively say a person with an eating disorder or at risk with an eating disorder, even if the behavior is the same, what's different is all of the other stuff that goes into that, the motivation, the drive. It really goes back to what we all learned in day one of Psych 101 back in undergrad, right? Behavior doesn't just happen. There's the ABCs of behavior, the antecedent, the behavior, and then the consequence. With eating disorders, we see the behavior and it can be excessive, and that's obviously concerning. But what we're really concerned about is that consequence of that dire case, emaciated, literally death's doorstep type person that we think of when we think of overexercise. What we ignore is the antecedent. How did we get there? Because there are people that can exercise and not experience those same consequences. In fact, exercise can be a very fulfilling and meaningful aspect of recovery for many, many individuals with eating disorders. The difference is the orientation that we take to get to that behavior. So it's more than just that behavior. And this is something, like I said, that's been well established now, actually, in the literature. Going back to around the turn of the century, Pam Keel, phenomenal researcher at FSU, and that pains me to say as a Gator, but phenomenal researcher at FSU had a seminal article, and this is a quote from the discussion section. The compulsory quality rather than the excessive quantity of exercise is a better characterization of exercise that is related to an eating disorder. These words right here were just a complete sea change in our approach. Once this was published, what you saw was everyone changing their dynamic and their approach to exercise away from, all right, well, let's modify it. Let's turn running into walking, or this into that, or, you know, let's just only do yoga or anything like that, to rather, let's understand the why of exercise. If you understand that why, you go back to that definition that we had about 2 or 3 slides ago. That's the key right there. For the better part of the last 20 years, this is exactly where my research has landed. It's been confirmed in a variety of different methods by a variety of different researchers around the world. So I can solidly say this is the way to go. If we're intervening on that why, on the psychological aspect of this, we can do a lot of work in unlocking how that exercise is feeding into the eating disorder versus how exercise may be feeding into sustained holistic recovery. And what we know is that typically for an eating disorder, the common, the usual suspects of offenders are using exercise as a sole coping mechanism, affect regulation, obviously using it to control weight or shape. And there's so much pathology about that, especially now under COVID and all of the memes about the COVID-19. And I don't mean the actual virus, I mean the weight gain, right? And all of those things that we see. And I apologize if that was a bit blunt, but these are the things that are out there now that we're having to deal with. So of course, then let's exercise because, it helps, air quotes on helps, right? That sort of thing. Exercising despite physical problems, how often we see people that are going out exercising, even though their body says, hey, dude, we need a break here, let's stop, exercising on a broken tendon or ligament or sprained ankle or something like that, where you're really just pushing through the pain. We know from other studies that pain understanding, biofeedback on pain is completely out the window when it comes to eating disorders. You keep pushing physically on something where your body should be telling you that there's a problem there, that's going to cause a lot of long-term problems. And eventually that does catch up. At last check, Mother Nature and Father Time are undefeated still. So it all does add up. How do we actually do that? Also, how does exercise interfere with other activities, taking you away from opportunities with social obligations, family obligations, work obligations, other obligations, any other opportunity that you have in life? These are the big things that we see with eating disorders. So a couple tools that y'all can use in your own practice. Like I said, since that article came out that said, hey, let's look at the compulsive quality of this as opposed to the excessive quantity of this, we've created a variety of different tools that can be used clinically as well. We use these clinically actually at Alsana. The one that I really want to emphasize is the compulsive exercise test. This was developed in eating disorders, for eating disorders, by eating disorder researchers and clinicians. It's a fairly easy test to administer, but there's a few tricky things with the scoring. This is the actual test right here. So I've sorted the items into their factor, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it's 24 items that get at the underlying causes, in other words, that why, that functional aspect of exercise with the eating disorder. And what we end up seeing is that those functional aspects coalesce around 5 major themes: avoidance and rule-driven behavior, weight control, mood improvement, doing exercise despite not enjoying it, and then just having rigid rules around exercise. I can tell you from working with clients at Alsana, we see a lot of heterogeneity. Not all clients are exercising to control their weight or to control their emotions. Some are doing it just because they have to. That would be more like an exercise rigidity thing. Things like that. If we know those are the specific things that they score high on, that's where we can do the work to understand that specific objective of exercise that we talked about before. So you can sum up these items. And I just want to point out 2 items, number 8 and number 12. And you see it where it says reverse. You just have to reverse score them. So a 0 equals a 5 equals a 0, a 1 equals a 4, and so on and so forth, based on that Likert scale. And then add them up. You add them up and divide by, you add them up and you get the total score. A score of 15 or more is a benchmark that we know that means exercise is clearly related to an eating disorder. A score less than 15 means let's pay attention to this. After that, look at the individual scores of the items for each factor. Then you'll be able to say definitively, quantitatively, hey, I know my client is using exercise for mood regulation. I know my client is using exercise for weight control. Those are the key things that we can hone in on therapeutically and then attack the root cause of the problem of how exercise is related here. So this is kind of the gold standard right now for measures in eating disorders with exercise. There's also a short screener called the Exercise Addiction Inventory. It's just 6 questions and very easy to score. 1 to 5 scale, 1 meaning strongly disagree, 5 meaning strongly agree. You add up the scores based on these 6 questions. And if you score above 24, that's more indicative of what we call an exercise addiction problem. I want to point out that these scales all use different terminology, compulsion, addiction, and so forth. What my research and research of others has shown, particularly some phenomenal research out of South Carolina, Tim Brewerton's work, have shown is that no matter what we call these things, if we call it a compulsion or an addiction, we're talking about one common phenomenon. So that's another thing that's really limited the field, is that we've really kind of argued with ourselves as professionals over what to call something, when in fact we're all talking about the same thing, and meanwhile our clients are the ones suffering from it. So we have to keep that in mind and be a little bit more humble about that. And quite frankly, I don't care if we call it an addiction, a compulsion, a dependence, whatever. I care about my client that's suffering from this and how can I help him or her. So this is a really powerful tool to give a kind of quick and dirty screener for an exercise problem. And this is the actual scale, so you can take this and use it. In terms of eating disorder risk, the easiest screener that's available is the SCOFF. Many of you have probably seen this before. It was developed in the UK, so the O out of the acronym SCOFF means 1 stone, but for us in America, that's 14 pounds. And basically what you do is you just ask these questions right here. So sick, control, 1 stone, fat, and food is where you get the acronym SCOFF. You can see that in the bold letters on the questions right there. And basically you just look at this and add up how many yeses do they have. And if you have each yes equals 1 point, 2 or more yeses likely means that this client, this person completing this questionnaire has an eating disorder. Validation studies have shown that for people that we know have an eating disorder, it hits 100% of them. It's really powerful. Even for people that we don't know if they have an eating disorder, we're up around 87.5%. So again, it's not a definitive diagnosis, but it's a good screener. So if you are, maybe in a fitness realm or something like that, and you're kind of wondering if a client might be struggling a little, if this excessive exercise is really about an eating disorder, this is a good thing to use as a screener to kind of understand that. When we look at this in terms of the scope of exercise problems in fitness centers, like I was mentioning a second ago, it's obviously very common. I mean, I'm sure we've all been in gyms or fitness centers where you look around and you just kind of get that gut feeling where like, I don't know, that person looks like they might be struggling with something. So a recent study that was just published in February actually assessed individual staff at about 300 gyms, looking at their patrons, the regular patrons, and about 42% criteria for an exercise problem. I'm sorry, this isn't a study that was published in February. The next study, the 140 fitness centers, was published in February. This is why I shouldn't have done the superscript references. I can't see the dates. This was a study that was published a few years ago, I'm sorry, where they assessed 300 patrons at the gym and found about 40% of them met criteria for an exercise problem. Those that had an exercise problem overwhelmingly had other comorbidities. And that's another thing that I want to emphasize, is that eating disorders don't exist on their own. They always have, almost always, have something else with them. And you can see this, a lot of compulsive buying, either bulimia, obviously anorexia. I don't know why this study didn't specifically look at anorexia, even just hypochondria. So this gets at more of those orthorexic type attitudes and things like that. We're all higher in the group of the individuals that struggled with exercise than the group that didn't. So we are looking at a very at-risk population for individuals that are the kind of habitual gym goers, the ones that are in there every day, no matter what. The next study is the one that was published just a few months ago in February. And what this one did was went around to 140 different fitness centers and asked the staff, the employees, of, how many people do you think, might have an eating disorder in here? So 75% of employees suspected at least one client having an eating disorder. So in other words, it's very common, widespread. What's more troubling, though, is a third of them didn't even do anything about it. So this is an opportunity that we're missing here, because there are a lot of people out there that need help. A lot of people are struggling with this, and we really need to get the interventions to where they need to be. The majority just didn't know what to do about it. So I think that's where we as a field can come in and give support to that and have those connections there for helping them. A few things that you can do if you do anticipate or suspect somebody is struggling with an eating disorder: looking for those that have lost a significant amount of weight in a short period of time. They're always there, even if they're, sick or have an injury or anything like that. If they're complaining about their performance falling off, even though you see them going on a full tilt, high exercise load, things like that. Certainly dizziness or fainting spells, anything like that is usually indicative of an underlying nutritional deficiency that's being exacerbated by the physical activity. Same thing with the kind of unsteady gait and, kind of unbalanced aspects and things like that. If they're experiencing difficulty concentrating or remembering, that's a real big thing. And obviously, if you see them purging or, anybody is saying, hey, something's up with Sally over here, then you might want to watch out with this. Okay, so working with a client that is at risk, these are the 11 guidelines that I mentioned before. It really does take a village on this. Everybody has a seat at the table, fitness professionals most notably included. Obviously, we need therapists, we need dietitians, we need medical staff, we need everybody. Keeping good monitoring on them, looking at them, screening for this exercise pathology that we just talked about in the compulsive exercise test or the exercise addiction inventory. Just getting some education around what it is that they need to be doing. Again, challenging those myths and misconceptions, kind of similar to what we did today. Focusing this on positive reinforcement, creating a graded program. Those next couple steps I'll let Abby talk more about, because this is what she does every day with her practice. And not forgetting that nutrition needs to be involved in this. It's really interesting. We published this in the flagship journal of the American College of Sports Medicine, because a lot of eating disorder journals that we went to with this said, take out stuff on nutrition. It has nothing to do with an eating disorder. And nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, if you're going to be moving, the number one thing for safety is to make sure that you've got the substrate available, the fuel available to move. If you're restricting and moving, that's where you have problems. If you're eating and moving, we generally don't see problems. And that's been documented in the literature even since we've published these guidelines. And then the last one is the most important. It's how we get at that function, how we get at that understanding of the specific objective. And that's debriefing or processing before, during, and after the exercise sessions themselves. So we have to balance this out in a comprehensive approach. For those of you guys that haven't heard of this, there is guidance here, the Safe Exercise at Every Stage document. This was put together by some clinicians and researchers based out of Australia. And what they did was we talked to people around the world that are using exercise in eating disorders and came up with a list of guidances. And they're in that link. So I know we don't have much time to really get into it. That could be a presentation in and of itself. But guidances of benchmarks that you want to look at to ensure physical safety, benchmarks of how much exercise you can do or can't do depending on the status of a client, and so on and so forth. So really phenomenal document that lays it out piece by piece in a lot of ways that a lot of people always ask me about with this. And what it does is it considers that full scope of how physiology and psychology interplay, how we incorporate rest, how we incorporate refueling, how we can even incorporate social connections and things like that to really get a more holistic form of recovery involved. Testament to that, we've got new research that shows if we do that, we actually see that exercise affects the same areas of the brain that an eating disorder does. So when a person is over-exercising, they're actually turning on the same areas of the brain, the middle frontal gyrus and the inferior parietal lobule, that we know are actually related to an eating disorder. we see these same regions implicated in controlling an eating disorder. So this is where we have to, first off, refuel, give the body the substrate necessary to make those different neurological connections, and then allow rest. We can't have exercise continue to be, kind of pounding on those areas of the brain without, allowing it time to rest and recover and regenerate. So we do see this physiological mechanism at play here. So it is a brain neurochemistry sort of thing that's happening, and a neurology sort of thing that's happening with all of this. So the kind of take home to summarize that previous slide, I realize I'm going a little bit quick, I want to be respectful of time right here, is that the same physiology is implicated in exercise burnout, over-exercising, and ED development and maintenance. So if we can then incorporate that, and this is what that Safe at Every Stage module that I talked about does, is how do we actually have that match with the physiology of the body? And when we do this, we see that it's really about working smarter, not harder. It's about allowing the body enough rest and time to do what it needs to do to get through not only the exercise in the short term, but the long-term gains that we're after with movement and everything else that we believe about that specific objective of exercise. So definitely looking at that similar underlap in the mechanisms and the physiology, and recommending rest is important right here. So really emphasizing this strongly on this. So probably way too strongly here. Got a little carried away with the animation. I was having fun when I put these slides together. So wrapping it up, keeping the big picture in mind, one thing that we have to think about is how all of these things fit together. Exercise is one key important piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only piece. So don't just put the blinders on and think only about what's happening overtly with the behavior. Think about the other stuff, the mental stress that obviously is included and is really indicative of an eating disorder. Just like what Marcy said at the beginning, the kind of psychiatric underpinnings of this. In a way, you can think of this as an eating disorder ramps up the sympathetic division of the nervous system. Well, exercise does too. Stress does too. All of these things, this kind of weird thing that we're all living under right now during a pandemic, that cranks up the sympathetic. We need to amp back down on that parasympathetic to get that rest and relaxation response back in. And then have that as a synergy, because when we have that as a synergy, then it can feed off of each other and we can actually make that system work more efficiently. If you keep turning it on and going up to 11 every single time, you're going to blow out the speakers. So we need to kind of ramp it back down to be able to ramp it back up. That's exactly where the eating disorder doesn't want to live. The eating disorder wants to live in just, if some is good, more is better. But it's really a matter of the ebb and flow, the kind of low tide, high tide sort of mentality of all of this. So thinking about all of that, exercise is only one part. And what I'll end on is this beautiful slide that I use with clients. I've used this in probably the majority of my presentations, but thinking about how all of this is a balance, and you have your physical stress, which would be your exercise, your mental stress, which would be your eating disorder. How do we actually have full holistic recovery from that? Well, it takes a variety of different approaches. It's not just about altering the physical exercise routine. It's not just about intervening on the mental eating disorder part. It's also about a holistic approach to sleep, to stress management, to nutrition, to social, relational factors, to medical issues. So this list is obviously not inclusive, but it does give you a good heuristic to think about when we think about how do we get back to a state of recovery on all of this. So on that, I will pass it off to Abby, and I realize I have control. Do you want me to just kind of cue me and I can advance these?
Perfect. Yep, that works for me.
Okay.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Brian. That was awesome. First of all, I'm so excited about that information, and thanks for passing it off to me. I am the owner of Clarity Fitness. It's a body positive gym out of the heart of downtown Decatur, Georgia. And we are currently offering online and in-person services for really approaching wellness and movement from a body positive light and an eating disorder informed way. So to start off, we really want to stress at Clarity Fitness the importance of the message that we're sharing. So we are incredibly scale-free. We're not focused on weight loss. We're not focused on, like Brian talked about, more is more. That's not how that works. We're focusing on celebrating our bodies and helping our clients learn to celebrate their bodies as they are today, and really looking at movement from a place of longevity and self-care instead of trying to force change or anything like that. All of our trainers are completely informed with this body positive messaging as well. And we are continuously looking at body positive wellness aspects. So we're really trying to continue our education, take different courses, stay informed. And we've also all signed the Health at Every Size pledge, which was a great team statement and team activity as well. We're all certified personal trainers in at least one different certification. So we really do know our knowledge and have incredible resources in our community, like Brian, who can make sure that we are doing things in a really positive way. We always work as a team. We're also really wanting to work as a team with any kind of treatment team. So we have all types of systems set up so that we can really be hands-on with everyone's patients or with the community that is bringing people through eating disorder recovery, and really want to make sure that that is a conversation that's being had as a unit instead of us doing our stuff, the healthcare providers doing their stuff, and keeping everything separate. When we can come together, that's when the magic happens. Go ahead and jump to the next slide. Thank you. We are doing all of our classes and personal training sessions with this emphasis on listening to your body, going at your own pace. Modifications are always widely accessible, and we really, really want to teach our members to figure out what works for them. And that is going to be different every single day. So we really want to look at people's relationships with exercise. We want to be able to hear certain things or phrases that are said and either pivot a conversation or give some information on resources that they can reach out to. We are also really wanting to make sure that we have the ability to start those conversations. So if there's someone who is struggling or who we're concerned about, we're not afraid to just communicate our concern. We obviously will not be diagnosing anything, but we do want to be able to have that conversation and voice what we think might actually help them. We've had our body positive perspective incredibly widely accepted by the community, and a lot of people are really relieved and get that sense of clarity, which is where our name comes from, of the gym, of that release and that lift of the pressure of feeling like they have to always be in the diet and exercise to the brink kind of mindset. With that, we're really closely linked to different healthcare providers, non-diet-based nutritionists, dietitians, the whole gang, to really make sure that we are a part of a community that can help on all those different aspects. So if you have any information, or if you yourself would like to be added to that list, please reach out to me and we can make sure that you're a part of our network as well. Last but not least, for us, we have brought our body positive messaging into the physical space itself. So our architectural plan was really taking account of how we were going to work well with the eating disorder community. I myself struggled with anorexia and bulimia for a large chunk of my life, and a lot of it was based in the fitness industry, and a lot of it was based on things that I thought were actually healthy, when in fact they were really damaging to my long-term wellness. So in learning all about this amazing world of recovery and living my life again, finding things that we can incorporate into the space, like really, really being selective about mirror placement and size, providing different sizes of spaces. So we have private personal training rooms that are accessible for people who either just want to get out of the chunk of all of the people working out, or are really looking for more of an intimate setting with a personal trainer, that they're kind of getting into exercise or learning about their body. We have that available. We have a private stretching area so that that can be more of a private situation instead of stretching in the middle of the space. We heard a lot of concerns about that. and a lot of past trauma and concerns that were brought up from stretching in the middle of a gym. We have really different aspect of the layout. So our cardio equipment is actually lining the mirror or the windows that we have, not the mirrors. So we aren't having people get on these different machines where looking at form really isn't as much of a concern, and placing them in front of mirrors, which can totally escalate those really tough body image experiences. And we have a really good balance, both of those more intimate spaces with community spaces, really figuring out how we can bring conversation, bring people together. And one of those examples is a joint locker space that we have. We do have private men and women's bathrooms, but there is a central area where we have our giant smash scale wall, which is one of my personal favorites, where we can continue conversation and dump some stuff in lockers if we don't need to go into the private rooms. And that really allows conversation from group classes and from the fitness experience to continue. Awesome. And I will pass the baton over to Paige, who is here to present a little bit more about how to incorporate food with the movement that we've been discussing.
Okay, I'm just going to take a couple minutes to share a resource with you all that EDIN has, very related to the topic that you've heard about, particularly with Brian talking about at-risk populations and the need for adequate fueling with that. So the program is called Running on Empty, and we have a full slide presentation online with EDIN slide presentations. It's a great educational tool for fitness trainers, for high school coaches, for anybody that's working with an athlete that may be at risk for an eating disorder or disordered eating, maybe even subclinical, because that's often what you'll see in these types of settings early on. So we can go to the next slide. One of the things that we are covering with this is kind of defining what we commonly see in athletes, as well as providing a lot of resources. EDIN being one of those, we're glad to bring speakers into your settings. For example, if it's a personal training setting, as we've done with Abby's setting, and obviously close to heart with her, we can bring in a speaker and a recovered speaker to talk about prevention strategies and things that are specific to this type of setting. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. And when I say at risk, as Brian was talking about, what we see in sport and athletics is kind of a new thing called relative energy deficiency in sport, REDS. And what you'll see if you take a closer look at this slide is how all the different body systems are affected by mild malnutrition. And particularly when we're talking about the exercising individual, this may be something that they're not aware of. That, you know, I think Brian did a great job hitting on the mental health side of it, but literally every single part of the body, every major system can be affected by mild malnutrition, not to mention ability to have appropriate power output during fitness settings. So trainers are often in a position to quickly identify if somebody's in a low energy state and possibly modify their workout. We can go to the next slide. And then with return to exercise, as this topic is obviously linking towards, if we have a client who's had an eating disorder and they've rebuilt their body appropriately and they're in a good place mentally to return, there are some medical guidelines that we recommend, and this was also contributed by one of our physicians that's on our advisory board, just step-by-step guidelines of how to slowly re-enter into a training regime. It wouldn't be an everyday hour workout when somebody is first returning to exercise. In fact, it may be just 2 times a week for 20 or 30 minutes. And many treatment centers that incorporate exercise do this in this fashion. So if someone's outside of a treatment center, it would be very important to very slowly build back the exercise, have their vitals monitored, make sure they're still weight stable, and make sure that they're fueling appropriately. We can go to the next one. So just a couple quick slides on fueling, because the biggest misconception out there, and has been for about the last, I'd say 10 years of my career, is the low carb diet popularity with the exercising population. So really encouraging your clients to fuel up with high carbohydrate foods before they exercise. A snack, for example, like this, not to be afraid of a sport beverage during their activity to help them get additional carbohydrate and electrolytes. And then I've just got a couple more slides, just very basics on nutrition, a good balanced lunch that might be an example for a school kid who's going to exercise after school, making sure that they do have the sandwich bread, that they maybe even have a grain side and a fruit with that meal. And again, a sport beverage may be appropriate at that time. And I think that's my last one next. And then again, just other snacks. I'm a big fan of high carbohydrate energy bars before activity, but unfortunately the most popular ones on the market are high protein energy bars. So helping your clients understand the difference between those types. For example, Cliff and Power Bar are two of the most common ones. So that's just a couple little things to keep in mind, that EDIN can be a resource. We have this great slide presentation that's available, and we can come into your setting and do a presentation. Abby and I have done these kind of things together, and we're glad to spread the word. All right, Abby, back to you.
Okay, awesome. And to close off, we were going to share a few testimonials from different healthcare providers in the greater Atlanta community, just sharing what they've experienced through Clarity Fitness. Let's jump over to Linda or Paige. Did you guys want to share really quick?
Hi, I am just so sitting here kind of feeling grateful to be able to be communicating with people like me who really care about these folks that we work with, and it's just kind of having a little grateful moment, and also so thankful to have met Abby. She is definitely one of my heroes. Abby has taken her personal experience and her knowledge and her wisdom and created a gym that I would not hesitate for half a second to send somebody to if they were, as long as the intention was fairly healthy and they were physically ready. As a psychologist for 30 years, that has not been the case. I have had people that I'd be really afraid to send or recommend going to a gym because either the fear that they would go and they would fall into this idea of just push, 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 don't listen to your body, or they feel shame, fear of being judged, and those things will not happen at Clarity. So hats off to you, Abby, and everything that you've done, and thank you so much for letting me be a part of what you're building.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate it. You're my hero too.
And I'll put in one additional plug as well. Abby hosted a wonderful gentle fitness outing during Love Your Body Month for a group of my clients, and they raved about it. Many of them were at the point of starting to return to exercise, and we had actually snacks there for them to have for before, hydration sources for them to have during, and recovery snacks for them to have after. And that's often a yearly event that we try to do during Love Your Body Month, and Abby's gym was a perfect fit for that, and she led the session, and it was very well received. So that's another thing, I think, specialized group classes like that they are able to offer for populations like this is another unique offering that they have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Paige. I so appreciate you being here. Awesome. Well, thank you. And we want to open it up also for any Q&A from anyone. Feel free to unmute yourself, or the chat. I'll have access to that and can read that out loud. So if there are any questions or anything.
Yeah, when are you going to start franchising?
As soon as Corona stops.
We need them all over Atlanta.
That sounds perfect. I'm very down.
This is Marcy. Thank y'all so much for doing it. I think that it was wonderful information. And I think Brian's right. I mean, there really is a huge myth about exercise restriction and when people get sick and how they kind of stop exercising in totality, some people. So I thought it was really, I learned a lot. And I think that for EDIN, it's really good to share that information too. So thanks so much for that.
Thank you.
Check out the 0K, y'all, and get online and look at EDIN. And also, EDIN's a nonprofit, so keep that in mind as you're thinking about all the charities that y'all donate to. Yeah, and watch for programming for both Clarity and for EDIN, and also Paige at NutriFit. Both of them are on the board, and also Linda Buchanan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Great.
Brian and Linda and Paige, Eden, everyone. You guys are awesome. So
Thank
excited
you.
to have everyone here. And have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.